He was on the veranda at Port Moresby when MacArthur stopped pacing and turned around. It was late afternoon, November 30, 1942. Robert Eichelberger had been flown up from Rockhampton, Australia, in a pair of C-47s, along with his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Clovis Byers. The veranda belonged to Government House, a rambling colonial building that served as MacArthur's forward headquarters. The city was 109 miles from the front. In every direction, the view was comfortable, green, and safe. MacArthur had been pacing. He did that when he was under pressure, which lately was all the time. His campaign to retake Papua New Guinea had stalled in a wall of jungle, disease, and Japanese bunkers. The American forces attacking the beachhead at Buna had been launching assault after assault for 2 weeks and gaining almost nothing. Washington was watching. The newspapers were watching. And across the Pacific, the Marines on Guadalcanal were getting all the headlines MacArthur believed he deserved. Major General Richard Sutherland, MacArthur's Chief of Staff, sat at a desk catching up on paperwork. He had just returned from a brief visit to the front, and his expression confirmed what the reports had already said. The situation was catastrophic. MacArthur stopped pacing. He looked at Eichelberger and spoke in what Eichelberger later described as a grim voice. He told him to relieve Major General Edwin Harding, to take command at Buna, and to remove every officer who would not fight, put sergeants in charge of battalions if necessary, put corporals in charge of companies, anyone who would fight. Time was of the essence. The Japanese could land reinforcements any night. Then MacArthur walked to the far end of the veranda, turned back, and spoke directly. "Bob, I want you to take Buna or not come back alive." He paused. Then, without even looking at Byers, he pointed a finger at him. "And that goes for your Chief of Staff, too." Eichelberger and Byers flew toward the front the next morning. Neither man knew whether he was flying to victory or to his death. What followed was one of the most brutal, costly, and deliberately forgotten battles in American military history. And the man who won it would spend the rest of the war watching someone else take the credit. This is the story of Robert Eichelberger, the General Douglas MacArthur needed, used, and then buried. When Buna fell, it was the first American ground victory in the Pacific. There were celebrations in Washington. There were communiques. There were photographs. Almost none of them mentioned Eichelberger's name. MacArthur made sure of that. And so the man who turned one of the most desperate situations in American military history into a victory spent the rest of the war fighting battles that filled no headlines and commanding armies that received no credit. He finished the war a 3-star general. He deserved 4. Let me start with who Eichelberger was before Buna, because this matters. He was born in Urbana, Ohio in 1886, the youngest of 5 children. He graduated from West Point in 1909, ranking 68th out of 103. That sounds unremarkable until you see who was in that class. George Patton graduated the same year. So did Jacob Devers, William Simpson, and a man named Edwin Harding, who would later be the general Eichelberger was sent to relieve. One class, 4 future generals at Buna alone. Eichelberger earned the Distinguished Service Cross not in World War II, but in World War I in Siberia. On July 2nd, 1919, he personally armed himself with a rifle and covered the withdrawal of an American platoon under enfilading fire. He negotiated the release of American prisoners by entering enemy partisan territory alone. He came home a combat veteran when most American officers of his generation had never heard a shot fired in anger. The interwar years brought him something equally important. From April 1935 to October 1938, he served as Secretary of the War Department General Staff. His boss was Douglas MacArthur. Eichelberger was MacArthur's gatekeeper, controlling everything that came in and went out. MacArthur trusted his competence, valued his discretion, and knew his capabilities. When MacArthur left the position, he wrote to Eichelberger that he would watch his career with keen interest. That letter matters. It tells you that by 1938, MacArthur had already formed a clear judgment about Eichelberger. He was capable. He was reliable. He was someone worth keeping in view. What MacArthur had not yet tested was what would happen when Eichelberger's success began drawing public attention. That test was coming. As superintendent of West Point from November 1940 to March 1942, Eichelberger modernized a place that had barely changed since the previous century. He cut back horseback riding and close order drill. He replaced them with modern combat training. He acquired new fields for flight instruction and hired Earl Blake to rebuild the football program. He was not a man who maintained institutions for the sake of maintaining them. He transformed them. By mid-1942, promoted to Lieutenant General and commanding 1st Corps in Australia, he immediately recognized the problem. The 32nd Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Wisconsin and Michigan, had been in constant motion since Pearl Harbor. They had been shipped from the United States to Australia and then shuffled from camp to camp. Their training had been elementary. When MacArthur's staff directed them toward Buna, they had never trained in jungle conditions, had never practiced the specific techniques for attacking log and earth fortifications, and had never worked alongside the Australian units they would be fighting beside. Their divisional artillery, 48 field guns, had been left behind in Australia due to shipping shortages. Eichelberger said all of this to MacArthur and Sutherland directly. He asked for more time. He was told to continue training in Australia. He watched from the sidelines as the 32nd Division was committed to a battle that was already failing before it began. Now MacArthur was sending him in to fix a disaster that never should have happened. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Buna. To understand what Eichelberger walked into, you have to understand what Buna actually was, because most Americans have never heard of it. The beachhead sat on the northeastern coast of Papua New Guinea, a coastal strip roughly 3.5 miles long and 3/4 of a mile deep. The land was barely above sea level. The water table was 3 feet down, which meant that if you tried to dig a foxhole, it filled with water before you got 2 feet deep. Annual rainfall exceeded 170 inches. Daily deluges of 8 to 10 inches were common. Humidity ran at 82%. Temperatures inside the kunai grass, the sharp-edged grass that grew to 6 feet high, could reach 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Troops who had been fighting for weeks were rotting in their clothes, their boots dissolving, their bodies covered in tropical sores. The 32nd Division had arrived without its artillery. MacArthur's headquarters had left all 4 battalions of division artillery, 48 field guns including 105 mm howitzers, behind in Australia because of shipping shortages. These men were being asked to crack the strongest fortifications encountered anywhere in the Pacific, without a single heavy gun. The Japanese had been building at Buna since July. Their bunkers were engineering masterpieces. Built almost entirely above ground because the water table made digging impossible, they used coconut logs up to 1.5 feet thick, interwoven and braced. Steel drums filled with concrete reinforced the walls. The roofs were multiple courses of logs, covered in alternating layers of earth. The entrances were in the rear and angled specifically so that a hand grenade tossed through the door would not kill the men inside. They were connected by crawl trenches, each bunker covering the approaches to the next. The jungle overgrowth hid them so thoroughly that American soldiers often could not see them until they were standing directly on top of them, and the spongy coconut wood absorbed shock so effectively that these structures could withstand almost anything short of a direct artillery hit with a delay fuse. The men who had been attacking these positions for 2 weeks had no artillery. They had almost no tank support. They had no naval gunfire, which makes Buna unique among major Pacific battles. The Navy was preoccupied with Guadalcanal. They had almost no close air support that could be used near friendly positions. They had been attacking with infantry, on foot, through swamp, against fortifications that were essentially impervious to everything they had. MacArthur's intelligence staff had told him to expect roughly 1,500 to 2,000 Japanese defenders. The actual number was approximately 6,500 battle-hardened troops. Here's the part no official history dwells on for long. By November 30th, the 32nd Division had already taken 492 battle casualties, and disease was doing far more damage than the Japanese. Out of approximately 10,800 men in the division, there were over 5,000 cases of malaria alone. At certain points, roughly 50% of the entire division was infected. Disease casualties outnumbered combat casualties by a ratio of 7 to 1. The 126th Infantry Regiment, which went in with 131 officers and over 3,000 enlisted men, was reduced to 32 officers and 579 enlisted men, less than a single battalion from an entire regiment. American troops had been ordered to attack fortifications that World War II infantry had no realistic way to destroy without the weapons that could destroy them, while being eaten alive by malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and scrub typhus. And they had been breaking. Reports reaching MacArthur described soldiers throwing away their weapons and running. Australian generals were openly mocking the American performance. It was the most embarrassing situation of MacArthur's career, which was saying something given that he had abandoned his troops in the Philippines only months earlier. Harding had not helped himself. He was not a coward, and he was not incompetent, but he was a commander overwhelmed by a situation no one had properly prepared him for. He had been pleading for tanks since October. He had been pleading for artillery. He had been told they were not available. He had been sending his men against positions that his men literally could not see until they were within arm's reach of them, with rifles and grenades against concrete-filled steel drums and interlocking machine gun fire. He was making desperate forward command post visits himself, trying to understand why his troops were failing, but he had no answers, because the answers required resources no one was sending him. MacArthur's solution was to relieve him and send someone else into the same impossible situation, but with a death threat attached. This was what Eichelberger flew toward on December 1st, 1942. He arrived at Dobodura Airfield and went immediately to the front. What he found confirmed everything. The troops were, in one contemporary description, perhaps among the most wretched-looking soldiers ever to wear the American uniform. Gaunt and thin, with deep black circles under their sunken eyes, covered in tropical sores, their clothes rotting off their bodies. They had been living in swamps for weeks with barely enough food to function. Some units had been reduced to a handful of men. The ones who could still walk were hollow-eyed. The ones who could not were lying in makeshift aid stations without adequate medical supplies or any realistic way to evacuate them. Eichelberger moved through this landscape without stopping. He talked to soldiers individually. He asked questions. He listened to answers. He made decisions. The next day, December 2nd, He relieved Edwin Harding and replaced him with the division's artillery commander, Brigadier General Albert Waldron. He replaced both task force commanders. He reorganized the scattered units, merged the corps and division staffs into a unified headquarters, and fixed the supply chain, which had become a shambles. He secured the tanks and additional reinforcements that Harding had been requesting and not receiving. And then he did something that surprised even the men who resented him. He put on his 3 silver stars, walked to the front lines, and stood there. He did this deliberately. He told officers who had gone to ground, "Boys, we are going forward. Come with us. I want to be direct about what this took." MacArthur had explicitly told Eichelberger that his name would be released to the press if he succeeded. That was the prize. But MacArthur had also told him he would not come back alive if he failed. Walking to the front line wearing 3 silver stars in a battle where Japanese snipers specifically targeted officers was not symbolic leadership. It was the kind of leadership that gets you killed. At one point, Eichelberger was pinned down for 15 minutes with bullets passing inches above his head. He wrote about it afterward with characteristic restraint. 15 minutes, he said. With imminent death blowing coolly on your sweat-wet shirt can seem like a long time. The man directing the entire campaign from Port Moresby had never been in that position. On December 5th, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. Eichelberger launched his first coordinated major attack. Staff Sergeant Hermann Bottcher, a German-born American who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, led 18 men in a push that broke through to the beach at Buna, splitting the Japanese positions and achieving what weeks of prior attacks had failed to accomplish. Bottcher held that sliver of beach against Japanese counterattacks for 5 days with 230 caliber machine guns and about 20 men. It was one of the most extraordinary small unit actions of the Pacific War, and Bottcher was a sergeant, not a general, not a colonel. MacArthur had told Eichelberger to put sergeants in charge if necessary. Here was the result. And on the same day, General Waldron was shot by a Japanese sniper. On December 16th, Clovis Byers was shot. Eichelberger was now the only American general officer at the front. He took direct command of the 32nd Division himself. 3 American generals had been shot at Buna. All 3 went down within 75 meters of Japanese lines. This tells you exactly how close to the fighting the command was operating under Eichelberger. It also tells you exactly how far forward MacArthur was not. The critical reinforcements arrived in mid-December. The Australian 18th Brigade under Brigadier George Wooten, along with Stuart tanks of the Australian 2nd 6th Armoured Regiment, finally gave Eichelberger the tools to crack the bunkers. The M3 Stuart was a light tank, armed only with a 37mm gun, but against infantry and log bunkers it was decisive. The tanks were not invincible. On December 24th, 4 of them attacked the old strip, and all 4 were knocked out within minutes by a single concealed Japanese 75mm anti-aircraft gun used in the ground roll. 4 tanks gone before the crews could react, in under 10 minutes. That was the nature of this fight. On January 1st, 1943, 11 tanks working with the Australian 2nd 12th Battalion destroyed the bulk of the remaining Warren Front fortifications in a single day. It was the kind of coordinated armor infantry assault that the Americans had been attempting to execute for 6 weeks without the assets to do it properly. Wooten's Australians provided the discipline and training. Eichelberger's reorganized command provided the coordination. The Japanese positions that had been holding for 2 months disintegrated in hours. On January 2nd, the government station fell. 2 senior Japanese officers committed suicide. Organized resistance at Buna ended after 45 days of fighting. Sanananda, the 3rd major position in the campaign, fell on January 22nd. The Papuan campaign was over. Here are the final numbers. Total Allied battle casualties for the entire campaign, 8,546. That included 1,731 Australian killed, 687 American killed, and thousands more wounded and missing. Compare that to Guadalcanal, which cost 1,600 American killed and 4,200 wounded. Buna cost 46% more casualties than Guadalcanal. The casualty rate was 3 times that of Guadalcanal as a percentage of forces engaged. 1 in every 11 Allied soldiers died. At Guadalcanal, 1 in 37 died. The Allies buried 7,000 Japanese dead. Another 4,500 were eventually evacuated. Most of the rest simply disappeared. Approximately 16,000 Japanese soldiers had been committed to defend Papua. Fewer than 5,000 came home, and MacArthur was in Port Moresby for all of it. This is the part the official narratives gloss over, so let me be precise about it. MacArthur never visited Buna, not before Eichelberger was sent in, not during the fighting, not after the position fell. He commanded the entire campaign from Government House in Port Moresby, 109 miles from the front, across the Owen Stanley mountain range. He visited Port Moresby's airfields and docks. He met with his Australian counterparts. He sent cables and communiques. He paced the veranda. The troops at Guadalcanal had their own version of this complaint about the senior command, but there was a meaningful difference. At Guadalcanal, the Marines were defending a position. The generals could plausibly be kept at a distance from the fighting. At Buna, American soldiers were being ordered to conduct frontal attacks against impregnable fortifications, and the general ordering those attacks was in a comfortable building more than 100 miles away. Not once, in the entire 45 days of fighting at Buna, did MacArthur cross the Owen Stanleys to see what his troops were actually facing. The nickname Dugout Doug had been born on Bataan when MacArthur visited his troops there exactly once before being evacuated. The soldiers on Bataan wrote a bitter parody song. The sentiment applied equally at Buna. In the Pacific Theater, this pattern was consistent. MacArthur issued communiques that described his personal direction of operations, his presence at the front, his leadership of men in battle. The men in those battles sometimes read those communiques in bemusement because they had never seen him. Eichelberger wrote to his wife Emma about this later, referring to MacArthur as the great hero, who, although not seeing Buna before, during, or after the fight, permitted press articles saying that he was leading troops in battle. After the campaign, MacArthur released a communique that included this line: "There was no necessity to hurry the attack because the time element, in this case, was of little importance." Think about what that sentence means in context. This was the commander who, 3 weeks earlier, had told Eichelberger to take Buna or not come back alive, who had explicitly said that time was of the essence, that the Japanese might land reinforcements any night, who had previously told Harding on November 21st to take Buna today at all costs, who had told the Australian General Herring that if the campaign failed, "I'll be finished, and so will your general Blamey." Now, with the battle won, the time element had been of little importance all along. Eichelberger wrote in his letters home, "I was feeling decidedly hurt." That is the most controlled sentence he ever wrote about MacArthur. The suppression of Eichelberger's name was systematic and began almost immediately after the victory. MacArthur had promised to release Eichelberger's name to the press. He kept that promise, briefly. The coverage was extraordinary. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran the headline, "General Eichelberger helps erase defeat of Bataan." Newspapers across the country praised the man who had turned the tide. MacArthur called Eichelberger in and made what the general described as a veiled threat to reduce him in rank and send him home. This was not because Eichelberger had done anything wrong. It was because the press coverage had been too favorable to Eichelberger specifically, rather than to MacArthur's theater command generally. After that meeting, Eichelberger told an Army public relations officer, "I would rather have you slip a rattlesnake in my pocket than to have you give me any publicity." The Distinguished Service Cross MacArthur had promised was awarded, but MacArthur gave it to 12 officers, using identical citations that credited precise execution of operations. One of those 12 was Major General Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, who had spent the entire battle sitting at a desk in Port Moresby. The same medal, the same citation. Sutherland, who had not been closer to Buna than 109 miles, received the same recognition as the general who had personally stood in the front lines and watched 2 of his senior officers get shot within arm's reach of Japanese bunkers. This was not an administrative oversight. It was a deliberate act of erasure dressed as decoration. Then Clovis Byers recommended Eichelberger for the Medal of Honor. MacArthur disappeared it. When Colonel Gordon Rogers submitted the recommendation directly to the War Department, MacArthur sent a message that torpedoed it. He wrote that among many outside Eichelberger's immediate staff, there had been criticism of his conduct of operations that had led to grave considerations at one time of his relief from command. Think carefully about what that sentence is doing. It is not a direct accusation. It does not say MacArthur was considering relieving Eichelberger. It says there had been considerations from unnamed people, which sounds like it could mean anything. No serious historian has found evidence that MacArthur had genuinely weighed relieving Eichelberger during the campaign. The man had just won the battle MacArthur needed him to win. But the message was worded precisely enough to cast doubt on a Medal of Honor recommendation, and that was its purpose. The Medal of Honor was never awarded. MacArthur's command operated under a system where all communiques credited MacArthur personally, unlike Eisenhower, who actively encouraged coverage of subordinates like Bradley, who directed Ernie Pyle to discover Omar Bradley. MacArthur ran a theater where subordinates, in the words of the anthology We Shall Return, labored in obscurity, fearful lest attention from the press lead to their replacement. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall reportedly described MacArthur's headquarters as less a staff than a court. Courts have kings. Kings do not share headlines. Eichelberger began calling MacArthur Sarah Bernhardt in his private letters to Emma. The comparison was to a theatrical performer, not a fighting commander. He wrote that the battle of personalities growing out of Buna was almost as important as the actual fighting. These letters were never meant to be published while MacArthur lived. After the war, Eichelberger donated all his papers to Duke University. He told people he intended to write a book that would destroy the MacArthur myth forever. He wanted the record corrected. He spent years gathering material. He published his official memoir, Our Jungle Road to Tokyo, in 1950. By that point, MacArthur was commanding United Nations forces in Korea and was possibly the most famous military figure on Earth. Eichelberger's memoir is careful, measured, and almost entirely devoid of the bitterness that runs through the private letters. He could not afford to tell the truth. MacArthur was still too powerful, still too celebrated, and still entirely capable of destroying Eichelberger's posthumous reputation the way he had damaged his wartime career. The book that Eichelberger actually wanted to write was never completed. He died in 1961. His letters were published 11 years later, in 1972, edited by Duke historian J. Louvas under the title Dear Miss M., General Eichelberger's War in the Pacific, 1942 to 1945. If you want to understand what Buna actually cost Eichelberger and what MacArthur's shadow actually looked like from inside it, that is the book to read. The contrast between those private letters and the diplomatic restraint of his published memoir is one of the more revealing documents in American military history. After Buna, Eichelberger expected another combat assignment. Instead, MacArthur created 6th Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger and gave it all the offensive operations. Eichelberger's 1st Corps was assigned to training divisions in Australia. He was sidelined for approximately 15 months. During that time, the War Department twice asked MacArthur to release Eichelberger for major European commands. First the 1st Army, then the 9th Army. MacArthur refused both times. Omar Bradley got the 1st Army. Eichelberger's classmate William Simpson got the 9th. Both became famous. Both had their names in every newspaper. Eichelberger escorted Eleanor Roosevelt on her visit to Australia in September 1943. I think about that a lot. The general who had been told to take Buna or die, who had stood in the front lines with his stars on while men were shot around him, who had turned a catastrophic defeat into an Allied victory, spent the following 15 months watching other men fight his war, while he organized training exercises and hosted the president's wife. Vindication finally came on April 22, 1944, at Hollandia. It was the largest amphibious operation in the Southwest Pacific Theater to that point. Eichelberger commanded 1st Corps, 2 full divisions, against a Japanese garrison of 11,000. He had spent the previous months doing what MacArthur had not let him do before Buna, training his men properly, physical conditioning, small unit tactics, amphibious procedures. When the landings came, they succeeded cleanly. MacArthur landed at Hollandia and was photographed wading dramatically through shallow surf. The communique credited MacArthur. Eichelberger's name again did not appear. At Biak, in June 1944, MacArthur sent Eichelberger in again after the 41st Division stalled against 11,000 Japanese defenders, and 3 critical airfields remained in enemy hands. MacArthur needed those airfields for the next phase of the campaign, and he needed them quickly. He called Eichelberger. Same pattern as Buna. Another general was failing. Eichelberger was the solution. This time, Eichelberger refused the frontal attacks that had been grinding the 41st Division down and maneuvered around the Japanese flanks instead. In 5 days, he secured all 3 airfields. Time magazine wrote that it was a clever job of tactics, no frontal assaults, much fast-stepping, cleverly conceived flank movement. Time called Eichelberger the team's imaginative, elusive halfback who took daring chances and made touchdowns. That was the American press, using a football metaphor to describe the finest American ground combat commander in the Pacific Theater. MacArthur called him my fireman. The nickname had 2 meanings. It acknowledged that Eichelberger was the man MacArthur sent when things were truly on fire. It also acknowledged, without quite admitting, that things kept catching fire on MacArthur's watch. In September 1944, Eichelberger took command of 8th United States Army, a force that would eventually conduct 52 separate amphibious landings in the Philippines. MacArthur consistently presented 8th Army as the second team, the mopping up force. When MacArthur declared that organized Japanese resistance on Leyte had ended on December 25, 1944, he turned the island over to 8th Army and announced the battle won. He was not correct. Eichelberger then killed 24,000 more Japanese soldiers in what the communiques described as mopping up. He noted this without emphasis in his letters to Emma. The tone was controlled. The bitterness was not. This pattern repeated itself across the southern Philippines. 6th Army got the major landings, the major press coverage, the major communiques. 8th Army conducted the unglamorous follow-up operations that were, in terms of actual fighting, often anything but unglamorous. 52 separate amphibious landings, 6 major operations, and 24 minor ones in a span of 44 days. An operational tempo that would have been considered extraordinary by almost any other theater standard. Almost no one in the United States read about it, because the communiques did not emphasize 8th Army, and the press corps followed the communiques. On August 30th, 1945, 15 days after Japan announced surrender, Eichelberger and a small detachment from the 11th Airborne Division landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. They were among the first Americans on Japanese soil. MacArthur arrived 2 hours later and was photographed descending from his aircraft in a pose that would become one of the most iconic images of the war. The man who had secured the airfield was standing somewhere in the crowd. Eichelberger commanded the American occupation of Japan until he retired on December 31st, 1948. Still wearing 3 stars. MacArthur never promoted him to 4-star general during the war. Walter Kruger, the man who had been given the offensive commands that Eichelberger had earned, received his 4th star in March 1945. Eichelberger received a tombstone promotion to full general on the retired list in July 1954. 11 years after Buna, 9 years after the war ended. The promotion gave him the title. It gave him no additional pay. He died on September 26, 1961, in Asheville, North Carolina, from pneumonia following surgery. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His wife Emma rests beside him. He donated his papers to Duke University because he had planned, as long as he lived under MacArthur's shadow, to write a book that would, in his words, destroy the MacArthur myth forever. He never wrote it. What is left is assessment. Robert Eichelberger was a genuinely great combat commander, not a perfect one. His relief of Harding was harsh and earned him real enemies among the 32nd Division's men, who named the division's cemetery Eichelberger Square, in a combination of grief and contempt. He was sensitive to criticism in ways that sometimes clouded his judgment. He could be vain about his reputation. Those are real flaws, and I am not going to pretend they are not. But historian John C. McManus, who has studied Eichelberger more thoroughly than any living scholar, calls him the best American ground commander in the Asia/Pacific theater, and I think that verdict is defensible. He solved tactical problems that other commanders could not solve. He did it at Buna, at Hollandia, at Biak, and across 52 amphibious landings in the Philippines. Every time MacArthur's campaign ran into something it could not get past, the solution was to call Eichelberger. That pattern speaks for itself. Historian Stephen Toff, writing what is considered the definitive history of the New Guinea campaign, describes MacArthur as a commander who valued time more than the troops under his command, and who frequently deceived both his superiors and the public in order to promote his own agenda. Samuel Milner, the official army historian of the Papuan campaign who spoke with Eichelberger personally, concluded in his 1957 history victory in Papua that the conditions at Buna were almost beyond description, and that the enemy had been expelled from Papua at a staggering cost in human life and suffering. Both things can be true. MacArthur won his campaigns. The men who actually won them remained, as the anthology We Shall Return puts it, in obscurity, fearful lest attention from the press lead to their replacement. The comparison I keep returning to is this. When George Marshall was selecting commanders for the European theater, he specifically valued generals who gave credit to their subordinates and built teams rather than cults. He chose Eisenhower for exactly that reason. Eisenhower then actively promoted Omar Bradley to fame, directed the press toward him, and gave him commands that matched his ability. Bradley became a household name because his boss wanted him to. Eichelberger served under a different kind of boss. Bradley and Patton are remembered. Kruger and Eichelberger are not. That difference is not a reflection of their soldiering. It is a reflection of who their commanding general was and what that commanding general wanted history to record. Buna was the first American ground victory in the Pacific theater. The men who fought there suffered a casualty rate 3 times worse than Guadalcanal. The general who saved the campaign stood in the front lines and watched his officers get shot around him. He was told to succeed or die, and he succeeded. His reward was 15 months of training exercises in Australia, a Medal of Honor recommendation that his own commander killed, and a career spent watching other men take credit for his victories. He retired as a 3-star general and received a 4th star as a tombstone promotion 9 years after the war ended, with no additional pay. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, in Section 2, beneath a headstone that gives his name and his dates. Nothing about Buna, nothing about the veranda at Port Moresby.